Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8 about civil liberties. It's Lesson 13 about the right to privacy. In this lesson, you'll learn about the United States Supreme Court case of Griswold versus Connecticut. You'll learn about the right to privacy, about the Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade, and the Supreme Court case of Obergefell versus Hodges. In previous lessons, we've talked a lot about how the United States Supreme Court can use its power of interpretation to create, define, or even destroy constitutional rights. In the last couple of lessons, we focused on how the court does this through the doctrine of selective incorporation. Now, we've discussed how selective incorporation involves two different kinds of due process being interpreted. One is procedural due process, where the court is worried about what procedures are being used to take someone's rights away. The other is substantive due process, where the court is worried about what rights are being taken. And then within substantive due process, there are two categories. Textual substantive due process, where the substantive rights that the court is trying to enforce, they borrow from elsewhere in the Constitution. And then there's non-textual substantive due process, where the court doesn't have anything that they can point to claim that's where we got the idea for this right. And so arguably, they're just making it up out of thin air. In the previous lesson and in this lesson, we're going to be looking at specific examples of non-textual substantive due process being practiced by the court. In the previous lesson, we spent a good deal of time talking about the case of Lochner versus New York, and about how that case was eventually overruled. And with it, the era of non-textual substantive due process that it had created came to an end. Essentially, the Supreme Court had given this doctrine a try, had ended up deciding on their own that it was basically an abuse of their power. It set them up in a position to decide the constitutionality of any law that they didn't like and dismiss it with this very theoretically weak notion of non-textual substantive due process. And eventually they decided they just shouldn't be doing that anymore. And the whole practice was discredited. And it stayed discredited for several decades. But it's just too tempting. Think about this power to enforce non-textual substantive due process rights sets up the court as the ultimate arbiter in society of what our government is going to be allowed to do or not do. That's an incredible rush of power for them. And it's very tempting to use this best tool to have that kind of power, this tool of non-textual substantive due process that gives them just basically unlimited power. And so although they tried to swear it off and say, okay, that was bad, we shouldn't have done that, we're not going to do it again, eventually a few decades later they started doing it again. Non-textual substantive due process came back in the case of Griswold versus Connecticut. This involved a law in the state of Connecticut that made it illegal to sell birth control devices in the state. Now, that may seem like a really crazy law from our modern standards, but as I'll explain more specifically in a moment, it was actually a fairly common sort of law back during this time period. It was a way for a legislature to state its moral preference for the people in its society. In this case, stating a moral preference that, hey, if you're having sex, you should be having children. But whether this law is a silly law or not isn't the question. The question is about whether or not Connecticut can create such a law. And the truth is that they weren't going around peering into people's houses trying to figure out if they were using birth control or not. Instead, they just used this law in conjunction with another law that made it illegal to advertise illegal services. So if somebody was quietly distributing birth control devices without putting out any advertisements, they could get away with it. But once they started making a public display of what they were doing, then the government could potentially crack down on them. And that's exactly what happened. A group of law professors at Yale Law School, along with some people from Planned Parenthood Corporation, decided to open a very public birth control clinic in Connecticut, basically daring the state to come invoke the law on them and punish them. Well, eventually that happened. The people who worked at the birth control clinic eventually got a $50 ticket from a police officer for breaking the law, and they used that ticket then as their ticket to get to the United States Supreme Court. Once there, the Supreme Court looked at this law, and if you read their decision, you can just really see how they desperately wanted to get rid of this law just because they thought it was a dumb, stupid, bad law. But the problem is that there was nothing in the Constitution that they could specifically point to say that a state shouldn't be able to outlaw birth control. So they were faced with a situation where the most obvious thing for them to do was to just invoke Lochner, to do the same substantive due process thing that Lochner had done for liberty of contract, but now do it for birth control. But they said they weren't going to do that. And the reason is because they admit that to do so would set them up as a super legislature. They would be getting rid of a law just because they think it's not a wise law, not because the Constitution actually says that it shouldn't be there. So, in saying that they don't want to Lochnerize, the court admits that using non-textual substantive due process would make them a super legislature. So then they get tricky with their decision to try to make it appear that this isn't what they're doing, but they make themselves look even sillier. The court in the Griswold case says that the Bill of Rights has penumbras formed by emanations, and that somewhere in those penumbras is a zone of privacy that they've created. What on earth does that even mean? Well, believe it or not, this idea of penumbra is something that they borrowed from astronomy of all places. Here's a diagram showing what a penumbra is. In the case of an eclipse, there's going to be some areas that are in complete shadow, the umbra, and other areas that will only be in partial shadow, the penumbra. So when we say the Bill of Rights has penumbras and within those penumbras somewhere is a right to privacy, we're talking about not just shadows, but partial shadows. So we've got items in the Bill of Rights casting shadows, and in those shadows somewhere, the Supreme Court has found a right to privacy. Now, why do they go through telling this silly story about a right to privacy? It's because they're trying to find some place where they can say, right there, that won't allow you to have this law against birth control. But at the same time, they don't want to admit that they're just making this thing up. They want to somehow, some way attach it to the actual text of the Constitution. But there's nothing in the text about birth control or anything like it. So they end up saying, well, the text casts shadows, and this is in the shadows somewhere that we found it. So no, we're not making this up. But the truth is, everybody knows they were just making it up. Here's one of the members of the court dissenting in the case. In other words, saying the majority's wrong, saying, look, I can't find this right to privacy that you're talking about anywhere in the Bill of Rights. Really, it's not there. And then going on to say that, in a different dissent, that what you're really doing is Lochnerizing. Yeah, you said that isn't what you're doing, but you are. So we've got multiple justices on the Supreme Court in dissent pointing out what the majority is actually doing. Well, whether they're just making up stuff or not, in the Griswold case, the Supreme Court used this doctrine of non-textual substantive due process to discover a right to privacy. Now, this is problematic for multiple reasons. One of those reasons we can obviously see if we just go back to the text that this supposedly is all based on. Supposedly what's happening in this case is the Supreme Court is telling the state of Connecticut that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment prevents them from outlawing birth control. And the reason it does is because this word liberty in the Due Process Clause, in their mind, includes this right to privacy, which includes this notion of you can sell birth control if you want, etc. But when they make this argument about the Due Process Clause, they seem to forget that there's another part of the clause. Right after saying that the state of Connecticut can't take away someone's liberty, it says, but actually they can, as long as they use due process of law. Now, that would seem to allow the state of Connecticut to take this right to, this privilege of birth control away from people. But the Supreme Court isn't going to let them do that. Essentially, they say this liberty is too important, so important that we don't care what process you go through to take it away from somebody, you're not going to be allowed to do so. Effectively, they cross out the without due process law part of the due process clause. So they take a clause about process and then they cross out the process part, because all they really want to do is use it as an excuse to protect things that they want protected, substantive things, without worrying what procedures are or are not involved. Now, this is problematic for a second reason, and that is the Supreme Court, in a quote that I've shown you before in this course, has previously declared that they aren't just going to make up new constitutional rights. Instead, if they discover something out there that you haven't seen before, it'll be because it's rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people, is what they say. Well, could that be true, that a right to birth control was rooted in the traditions and the conscience of our people? So it's sort of an unenumerated right out there that the people would all know and understand, even if it was never listed. And so the Supreme Court could arguably say we really weren't just making it up. No. At the time the Griswold decision was handed down, 38 states had laws like this. How can you say it's within the traditions of our people not to outlaw these things when 38 of the 50 states outlaw them? Something that's outlawed by most of the states is part of our tradition then to have it outlawed, not part of our tradition to not outlaw it. I used a double negative there. Let me try to say that in a better way. In order for something to be rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people, we have to be saying that this is how we traditionally did things. So if we're going to say a right to birth control is rooted in the tradition and conscience of our people, we're going to have to be saying that traditionally people were allowed to use birth control if they wanted. But we've got 38 states that have outlawed it. So that really can't possibly be the tradition. So this test that the court is claiming that they're using to decide what an unenumerated right is, they're not actually using it. There's an additional problem. They're finding this right to privacy, which includes a right to birth control, in the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. But the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution on July 9th, 1868. Yet somehow, this right to birth control was not noticed for almost 100 years. Now, which makes more sense? That this right to birth control was put in the Constitution on July 9th, 1868, and nobody noticed it until the 1960s, or that it was never there in the first place and the Supreme Court is simply making it up, inventing it in this case. I think the latter is obviously true. It's the Supreme Court inventing a new constitutional right. The next example of this is a case that then built upon Griswold, Roe v. Wade. The Roe v. Wade case was about a woman who went by a false name Roe so that her privacy would be kept at the time, who lived in Texas and wanted to get an abortion but was prohibited by Texas law. She went to court. Eventually her case went over to the United States Supreme Court. Now, as I show you these cases, I always like to get a photo that will tell you something about the case, if possible, get the people that are involved in the case. And that's what I did for the photo on this page. I found the woman who was actually Roe in the case, who was trying to get an abortion. Two interesting things about it. One, by the time the case actually got to the Supreme Court and she won and was then authorized to get an abortion, she'd already had the child. And so it didn't matter anymore. The second thing that's interesting is she and the child she ended up having are now both anti-abortion activists. Just an interesting thing. So when I went to find a picture of her, this is the picture I could find of her at an anti-abortion rally, even though she is the person who brought the famous case that ended up giving the Supreme Court an opportunity to declare a constitutional right to abortion. Well, in the case, the Supreme Court relied on Griswold versus Connecticut. They said, okay, Griswold versus Connecticut said there's a right to privacy. All right, there's a right to privacy in the 14th Amendment. Griswold said so. Well, in this case, we'll just decide that it's big enough to include a woman's right to end her pregnancy. Well, some of the justices that participate in this case ended up dissenting and saying, wow, you got that wrong. I'm sorry. You are just inventing a new constitutional right here. It's not in the Constitution anywhere. You just made it up. That's problem number one, just like with Griswold. Another problem, just like with Griswold, is that if they are going to simply pull a non-textual right out of the air, they have said they will only do so for rights that are rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people. In other words, something that we as a people have long recognized, that pretty much everybody understands as a right, even if it isn't written down somewhere. But the decision in Roe v. Wade struck down abortion laws in all 50 states. How can you say it's our tradition not to have laws about this sort of thing, when actually all 50 states did have laws about these kind of things? So, if all the states had laws regulating abortion, it cannot possibly be rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people to not have laws about this thing. Another problem, just like with Griswold, is that this right to abortion, if it exists, is found in the 14th Amendment, which was added to the Constitution on July 9, 1868. That means that on July 9, 1868, if there's a right to abortion in the 14th Amendment, that right existed on that day in 1868. Yet somehow no one noticed that there was a right to abortion in there for over 100 years. Now again, which makes more sense? That there was a right to abortion in the 14th Amendment that nobody noticed for over 100 years, or that in 1973 the Supreme Court simply made up a new constitutional right on their own authority. Obviously, it's just the Supreme Court making up a new constitutional right. Okay, the last example of how the Supreme Court uses its power of non-textual substantive due process to create new rights is the case of Obergefell versus Hodges. This is a case where a same-sex couple wanted their marriage recognized by the state of Ohio where they lived, and they took their case over to the United States Supreme Court. In the case, the United States Supreme Court determined that, in their opinion, there's a fundamental right to marry found in that word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which then requires states to recognize the same-sex marriages of couples like this. Well, let's go back to the standard the Supreme Court has previously announced of where they would find these non-textual rights. They said rather than them just making it up, they'd be things rooted in the traditions and conscience of our people. Well, same-sex marriage has been considered an inappropriate activity by most societies through most of recorded history. For thousands of years, the political and moral heritage that preceded the United States of America considered such behavior to be inappropriate. And even at the time that Obergefell was decided, 40 states outlawed gay marriage. Well, how can you say that it's in the traditions and conscience of our people to allow gay marriage when for thousands of years it's been outlawed, and at the moment the court decision was made, 40 states still outlawed it? Again, it doesn't make sense. It's not the court actually enforcing traditions and conscience of the people. Instead, it's the court enforcing its own conscience on the people. The last problem is, just like with the other cases, if there's a right to gay marriage in the Constitution to be found in the 14th Amendment, then it was added to the Constitution on July 9, 1868. The right to gay marriage was added at that moment. Because if it wasn't added to that moment, then obviously the Supreme Court is just making it up. Well, if they didn't make it up, the alternative is that somehow there was a right to gay marriage in the Constitution and no one noticed it for almost 150 years, which is kind of an absurd thought. So the only alternative is that the Supreme Court is simply making up this right. So these then are examples of the power the Supreme Court has to create, define, and possibly even destroy rights. Now, as I present these examples, please don't misunderstand the point I've been trying to get across. I am not trying to say that birth control should be outlawed, or that abortion should be prohibited, or that same-sex marriage should be banned. I'm not taking any stand on any of those, whether they're good or bad. I'll let you decide for yourself whether they're good or bad. All I'm trying to point out is that when we declare them rights, it's the Supreme Court declaring them to be rights by its own authority. It is not enforcing anything that's found in the Constitution or in the history or tradition of the American people. Instead, it is using its authority to create brand new constitutional rights. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What non-textual right was discovered in the Griswold case? Was it birth control, abortion, drug use, or same-sex marriage? The Griswold case was where the Supreme Court discovered a non-textual substantive due process right to birth control. What non-textual right was discovered in the Roe v. Wade case? Was that birth control, abortion, drug use, or same-sex marriage? Roe v. Wade discovered a constitutional right to abortion. What right that the Supreme Court recognized actually covers both abortion and birth control? Is it population control, a right to that? Or is it a right to irresponsibility? Or is it right to free sex? Or is it a right to privacy? The Supreme Court in the Griswold case claimed they had discovered a right to privacy, which was big enough to include the ability to choose whether or not you were going to get birth control. In Roe v. Wade, they decided this right to privacy was also big enough to cover the choice to get an abortion. What non-textual right was discovered in the Obergefell case? Was that a right to birth control, a right to abortion, a right to drug use, or a right to same-sex marriage? In the Obergefell case, the Supreme Court discovered a right to same-sex marriage. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 8. It'll be Lesson 14 about the difference between can or should.